ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. All three of them will impact the exposure of your image in a different way, and depending on the situation, you may need to adjust one of them. But ultimately, in order to get a perfectly exposed shot both in photo and video, you may need to adjust all three of them. And in this video, I'm gonna tell you all the basics coming right up. What's up everybody, my name is Sean, welcome to my tech channel. If this is the first time you're stopping by and you enjoy tech content like this, you may want to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notifications so you won't miss my future videos. If you're a return subscriber, thank you so much for stopping by for another video. When you're trying to shoot in full manual mode, it can be a little bit overwhelming, but all you need to know is these three settings to be able to take advantage of all the power that your camera will offer. ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, they are known for exposure triangle because they work together to try to give you a perfectly exposed shot. First, I'm gonna tell you how each of them would work, what they mean, and how they will impact the image, and then at the end I'm going to tell you how they all work together. First, let's start with ISO. ISO is the sensitivity of the sensor. The higher the ISO number, the more sensitive the sensor is when the light will hit it. What that means is in a lower light situation, when you are shooting outdoor, let's say at nighttime, you have to turn up the ISO to a higher number to make the sensor more sensitive to be able to capture a shot that is not too dark. The negative side of a high ISO is it will introduce some noise and grain into the image. Every camera, every sensor is going to be different, and the amount of noise that they will add to the image is also going to be different. For example, I'm shooting with a Canon 80D, and in my camera, I'm comfortable to go up to about 800 ISO without really notice any gain, at least not for the YouTube videos that I'm posting. But like I said, every camera is going to be different. To demonstrate the impact of the ISO, right now I'm shooting at ISO 250, and as you can see, I have a nicely lit image. If I go ahead, turn off the lights that I have in my room, you can see the image does not look that good. So one way for me to try to properly expose this, I can go ahead, crank up the ISO to try to make the sensor more sensitive to light, and this is how I can potentially get a properly exposed shot. Now the downside of it is, as you can see, the high ISO, it is introducing a little bit more noise and grain into the image, and some of your mid-tones can look a little bit flat. Next, let's talk about shutter speed. Shutter speed is the speed that the shutter will open and close to let the light in to hit the sensor. Now, the faster the shutter speed, that means you're gonna be able to let less light in, and on the opposite side, the slower the shutter speed, that means you're gonna be able to let more light in. Now, what are some of the pros and cons, and when would you want to use either one of them? When you have a fast moving object, for example, you are taking pictures of race cars or athletes in the middle of a game. Because they're moving so fast, you want to be able to freeze the action in time when you want to capture that image. Therefore, you have to have a very fast shutter speed to be able to capture that action in your picture. Now, as a result of it, because the shutter opens and closes so fast, you're gonna be able to let very little light in, which means you have to rely on the other two parts of the triangle, your ISO and your aperture, to be able to expose your shot, which I will tell you guys more coming up. Most of these settings are going to be exactly the same, and the concept would apply whether you are shooting photos or videos. But there's one thing in particular a little bit unique about shutter speed if you're shooting video. When you shoot at, let's say, 24 or 25 frames per second, in order for you to capture the natural motion blur that human eyes will see, you need to set your shutter speed at double the frame rate. For example, at 25 or 24 frames per second, double that would be 50. So you would set your shutter speed at 1/50th of a second, and that is going to be the closest natural motion blur you can capture in the video. Here's a quick demonstration of how you're able to capture a natural motion blur when you double your frame rate to get to your shutter speed. Right now I'm shooting at 24 frames per second, shutter speed 1/50th of a second. So as you can see, you get a natural motion blur, and this is very similar to what human eye will see. To demonstrate the difference, I'm going to crank up the shutter speed and have a faster shutter speed, and the shutter speed is at 1/500th of a second. And as you can see, the image does not look real because you don't get the natural motion blur that human eyes is used to seeing. This is why you want to always have your shutter speed double your frame rate. In this case, like I said, 1/50th of a second when I'm shooting at 24 or 25 frames per second. The third setting would be your aperture. Aperture is how wide the opening of the lens is. The higher the aperture, that means the wider and the more open your lens is, and the smaller the number. That seems a little bit backward and it could be confusing, but let me give you an example. An f1.4 aperture is a larger aperture than f2.8. So the higher the number in the aperture, that means the smaller the opening. Naturally, the smaller the opening, that means you will let less light in, and the wider the opening, you are able to let more light in. There is a unique characteristic of the aperture number that is heavily going to impact the quality of the image you get, and that is the depth of field you get. The larger the aperture, which means the smaller the number, you're gonna have a much more shallow depth of field, and that is how you're able to get that really nice blurry background, and you are able to get the same effect both in photos and videos. For example, in this shot, I'm at 1.8 aperture and I have my ISO at 200 and my shutter speed at 1/50th of a second because I'm shooting at 24 frames per second. As you can see, there is a very shallow depth of field, and there is a very distinct bokeh blur that you get depending on where you're focusing. Now I can have the same shot if I go and change my aperture to a smaller opening, so let's say 10, to trying to get most of the shot in focus. Then in order for me to properly expose this, I can change my shutter speed, or I wouldn't want to, at least at this point. I can go ahead, increase my ISO, and I am up to 4000 ISO right now. So this is at 5000 ISO and at aperture of 10.0. So again, in order for me to try to get most of my subject, all 4 cans, in focus, I had to adjust my aperture primarily, and then the ISO and shutter speed will follow to try to get a nicely exposed image. So we reviewed the basics of ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, what they are, and how each of them will impact the exposure of your shot. Now, depending on the type of scenario you have, you always will lead with one of these settings and the other 2 will follow. For example, let's go back to the sports example I shared with you earlier. In order for you to capture an image of a fast-moving car, you are forced to set your shutter speed to be really fast, maybe 1/1000th of a second, for you to be able to capture that car that is driving at over 200 miles per hour. So we are forced to have a very fast shutter speed based on that scenario. Then we would like to have a fairly low ISO, and then based on that, we will see what opening of the lens or what aperture we need to have to be able to have a properly exposed shot. Now, same thing with the videos. Depending on the frame rate I have selected, I am almost forced to try to set my shutter speed at that level. So I'm shooting this video right now at 24 frames per second, so I am forced to have my shutter speed at 1/50th of a second. And then with the amount of light I have both on my desk and right here above me and my hair light back here, I will try to see what amount of ISO I need to set to be able to capture the right image at f2.0, which is this lens offers. Most cameras, by the way, actually have this option built into them. You have spot metering, so you can simply halfway push the shutter down, and it's gonna tell you if that scene or that spot exactly in your photo or image it is properly exposed, overexposed or underexposed. I know this all sounds really confusing, but my goal from this video is, if you have never tried to shoot in a manual mode, just go ahead, explore. Go ahead, put the camera dial on M and start playing around with these 3 settings. Depending on the type of camera you have, these settings in the menu will be accessed a different way, whether you have a Nikon, a Canon, or a Sony, but just go ahead, go through them, play around with these 3 settings, and the more you work with these 3 settings, you really get a good feel how all three would actually complement one another based on your scenario. The topic of proper exposure can be very in-depth and very complex. This was just a surface level beginner's view of how to properly expose your shot. Comment down below, let me know what type of camera you have, and have you ever shot in a manual mode? Is there any one of these particular settings that you're not comfortable with and you have any additional questions that I can answer for you? Definitely ask down below. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please remember to give it a like, and I'll see you in the next one.